All right, then we're about to start. I just checked the weather. First of all, thank you so much for coming. I know this could not have been an easy choice. It's cold and it's going to get colder, so cold tonight that apparently everyone who loves this basil really needs to rush home and save the basil. But that's not why we're here tonight. Can you hear me okay? Well, we're here actually to celebrate, on the one side, the 10th anniversary of the Center for Values, and then to welcome a wonderful speaker. And in between the cold and the cold weather, we also are here to make some interesting announcements. But let me first introduce myself. My name is Niels Roma. I'm the interim dean for the School of the Arts and Humanities. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all tonight to this lecture. That is, if we brought some more cold, some sweaters and the lights are wrong. I also want to thank really Inga Musselman for being here, and really this is a wonderful opportunity. It's the 10th anniversary of the center, it's the 50th anniversary of the university, so there's this wonderful kind of coming together, and therefore it could not have come in any better place than tonight really to make this as an opportunity to announce the new support for the center that has now allowed the university and the School of the Arts and Humanities to establish the Marvin and Kathleen Stone Distinguished Professorship of the Humanities in Medicine and Science. And there's one more. And the Marvin and Kathleen Stone Scholarship and Fellowship to support students. You know, it just strikes me, we always use this word investment, and normally investment is a word that we use in reference to financial investments, but truly investment in education is the real meaning of the word investment in my mind. It's an investment into the future, and these endowments really have the beauty of keep giving in the future forever and ever in terms of what it enables. So really, thank you very much for the trust in us and for the trust in particular into the Director's Center. Matt Brown, who I would like to introduce now. This mic is not temperamental.
Okay, thanks, Nils. Yeah, as he said, I'm Matt Brown. I'm the director of the Center for Values in Medicine, Science, and Technology. And I would also like to thank Marvin and Kathy for their wonderful gift that shows a real sort of statement of faith in what we're doing here. So I really appreciate it. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Jacob Stegenga, reader in the History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Cambridge. Jacob's done important work in philosophy of science, philosophy of biology, and importantly for tonight's lecture, philosophy of medicine. He has studied at the University of Toronto and the University of California, San Diego. He has had positions in universities, first-rate universities in the US, Canada, and the UK. We're very happy to have him with us here tonight. He is the author of 2 books, Care and Cure, An Introduction to Philosophy of Medicine, and Medical Nihilism, which is part of what he'll be talking about here tonight. It's got a very lovely cover, and it'll be on sale after the lecture outside, and Dr. Stegenga will be signing the book if you're interested. I've known Jacob a long time. I've always found his work engaging and thought-provoking, and I've really benefited from it. And I think you're in for a treat, so please welcome Dr. Jacob Stegenga to the stage.
Thanks, Matt, for that kind introduction. I'm really delighted to be here to share with you my recent research. So many of us are familiar with headlines like this, headlines that describe a great amount of uncertainty in medical research, headlines that describe frustrations with contemporary medical interventions, headlines that describe biased medical research, and in the worst cases, fraudulent medical research. And it's not just journalists contributing to this sort of genre. So here are a bunch of books written by some of the world's most important physicians and epidemiologists and academic commentators on medicine. The books on the left are worried about what these critics take to be spurious disease categories. So for example, the loss of sadness. So these critics say regular suburban sadness is being over-diagnosed as depression, say. The books in the middle are worried about medical interventions themselves. So pharmaceuticals which have been over-prescribed and have much smaller effect sizes than often made out to be. The books on the right are worried about what these critics take to be the nefarious influence of industry on medical research. My personal favorite title in this genre is the one on the bottom right here, Deadly Medicines and Organized Crime. Now, these aren't cranky outsiders. So, for example, Marcia Angel was the chief editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, one of the world's most important medical journals, for many, many years. Peter Gotcha, the author of the book Deadly Medicines and Organized Crime. Peter Gotcha is one of Europe's most important epidemiologists. Here is a passage from the current editor of The Lancet, another one of the world's most important medical journals. Here's what the editor of The Lancet has to say about contemporary medical science. Afflicted by studies with small sample sizes, tiny effects, invalid exploratory analyses, and flagrant conflicts of interest, together with an obsession for pursuing fashionable trends of dubious importance, science has taken a turn towards darkness. Science has taken a turn towards darkness. A few years ago, I got interested in this critical genre, this collection of books and articles that were worried about these various aspects of medicine. I made it my job to assess the merits of the arguments that were being put forward about the kind of skeptical arguments about medicine. And in my view, this critical genre was making several key arguments that support a thesis that I ended up calling medical nihilism, which is the view that we ought to have little confidence in the effectiveness of novel medical interventions. So Matt kindly already noted that that culminated in this book published last year. My plan in the next half an hour or so is to describe the kind of big picture contour of the book. So I'm going to describe the forest at the expense of the trees, but in describing the forest, I will describe a few trees here or there to give you a feel for what the arguments look like. Before I dive into the big picture argument, I want to note two kind of obvious facts. One is that this skeptical tone about medicine is in tension with what appears to be this wild enthusiasm that we have for medicine, the royal we. Physicians, patients, policymakers. So by almost any metric, like number of prescriptions, number of patients on multiple prescriptions, profitability of pharmaceutical companies, by almost any metric, it looks like we have great enthusiasm for medical interventions. The second kind of key kind of background, obvious fact that I want to note is that skepticism about medicine has been around a long time. It's easy to find in the history of medicine or the history of art, history of culture, criticisms of medicine. So here, for example, is Dryden. Better to hunt in fields for health unbought than fee the doctor for a nauseous draught. The wise for cure on exercise depend. God never made his work for man to mend. So lived our sires. Here, doctors learned to kill and multiplied with theirs the weekly bill. So here we see three arguments in this one passage from Dryden. Well, actually, it's two passages, but I've just, for the sake of presentation, combined them. The three arguments that we've already seen in this contemporary genre that I had up on the slide a few moments ago. So the three arguments are this sort of in principle untreatability of many diseases. God never made his work for man to mend. Or the ineffectiveness of many medical interventions, so the drafts are nauseous. Or this corrupting influence of financial incentives. The doctors are just multiplying with theirs the weekly bill. Fast forward a couple of hundred years into the middle of the 19th century. In the middle of the 19th century, it was very fashionable to be skeptical about medicine. So many physicians themselves in Boston, New York, and Paris called themselves therapeutic nihilists. And this was like the good doctors were therapeutic nihilists. So here, for example, is the dean of the Harvard Medical School saying, if the whole materia medica, if all of our drugs could be sunk to the bottom of the sea, it would be all the better for mankind and all the worse for fishes. So it's easy to find in the history of medicine proclamations of skepticism about medicine. But it's another thing to be skeptical about medicine today. So in the early decades of the 20th century, from about 1920 to 1950, there were a great number of medical breakthroughs that really revolutionized medicine. So we had vaccines for fatal infectious diseases, we had insulin for type 1 diabetes, we had antibiotics like penicillin. These breakthroughs were really revolutionary for medicine. And many commentators on the history of medicine say that this period of medical breakthroughs basically put an end to this fashionable medical nihilism. But then we see in recent years these books by people like Marcia Angel or Richard Smith, these editors of big medical journals, kind of reintroducing this skepticism about medicine. So that's what I'm curious about. Is this thesis, medical nihilism, persuasive? To assess the disparate arguments that these various critics are making, I try to use a kind of philosopher's tool, a set of formal ways of thinking about science to assess the disparate arguments and to bring them all together into one coherent package. This isn't my innovation, so this is a kind of standard way of thinking about scientific inference among philosophers. The way we like to think about, well, philosophers in general have a fetish for formalisms. So we like to try to formalize arguments to try to make them as crystal clear as possible. So here's how this goes for medical nihilism. Suppose we have some hypothesis, like this drug is effective. And we have some evidence, which is like the publicly available evidence about that hypothesis. This could be the results of a randomized control trial or a big meta-analysis on all of the available trials. So E is the publicly available evidence about H, about the drug in question. We can represent our confidence in H, our confidence in the medical intervention by what's called a conditional probability. The probability that the hypothesis would be true given the evidence that we have. Now, you'll just have to take my word for this. Because this is a conditional probability, we, philosophers of science, like to apply what's called Bayes' theorem to get this little handy formula. Now, the reason why this formula is so handy is this formalism can be used to represent various aspects of scientific inference. And so that's how I formulate what I call the master argument for medical nihilism. So here's the master argument in a nutshell. This term, the so-called likelihood, is low. This term, the so-called prior probability of the hypothesis, is low. And this term, the so-called expectancy of the evidence, is high. And by simple algebra, our confidence in medical interventions ought to be low. So that's neat and tricky. But of course, the challenge is to defend the premises. So we have a deductive argument, 3 premises and a conclusion. The conclusion obviously follows from the premises. But the hard part is defending the premises. That's what I spend 12 chapters doing. So in the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to give you a feel for what those arguments look like. This term, the so-called likelihood, the probability that you'd get the evidence that you in fact got if the hypothesis were true, that term is low for strictly empirical reasons. In clinical research today, it turns out that the vast majority of interventions under investigation have tiny effect sizes. I'll give you a bunch of examples in a moment. This term, the prior probability of the hypothesis, the probability that your hypothesis would be true before you get this new empirical evidence, that term is low for a reason that I call a dearth of magic bullets. Magic bullets are interventions like penicillin or insulin for type 1 diabetes. Interventions that have a high degree of potency and a high degree of specificity. They're very effective with side effects that can be managed well. This term, the so-called expectancy, the probability that you'd get the evidence that you in fact got regardless of whether or not the hypothesis is true, this term is high because of sociological reasons about clinical research today. Clinical research is shot through with biases. And so when we ask ourselves, like suppose you read the New York Times about some new intervention that there's some trial testing this new intervention, and the trial suggests that the intervention does blah, blah, blah. And you ask yourself, well, what's the probability that I'd see evidence like that, regardless of whether or not the intervention in fact does blah, blah, blah? Given the various biases in medical research, the answer is high. Your probability that you'd see evidence like that is high. I'll explain that in a little bit more detail in just a moment. So there's the master argument summarized. And the real work is, the real kind of thrust of this critical genre that's articulating this skeptical position about medicine is to defend those three premises on the right. Let's start with this term. Medical research today is shot through with a number of biases that stacks the deck in favor of interventions being tested. There are a few key biases that critics have noted. The measuring instruments themselves that are used to gather data in clinical trials are biased towards suggesting that interventions are more effective and safer than they in fact are. The way subjects are recruited into trials systematically stacks the deck in favor of the interventions under investigation. And then various practices that are labeled terms like p-hacking or publication bias. So publication bias is the publishing of results that are favorable to your hypothesis of interest or your drug under investigation, and the withholding of results that are unfavorable. So these are known biases that are widespread in clinical research today, and when you sum them all up, you get a deck which is stacked. I'm going to give you an example of the first problem. I'm going to dive in to a little bit of detail to give you a feel for what this problem looks like. The Hamilton Rating Scale for Depression is a questionnaire which is meant to measure the severity of depression of a research subject. So there's 20 questions, and for each question, you have 3 or 4 possible answers, and each possible answer gets a score, and then all the scores are summed up. You get a total score of about 50. The higher the score, the more severe a research subject's depression is. And so the point of a randomized control trial, testing an antidepressant, is to get the HAM-D score of patients in the drug group to go down by more than patients in the placebo group. Here's what the HAM-D score looks like. That's too small for you to read, so I'll just zoom in a little bit. So you can see that there are various questions about, say, insomnia, like whether or not a person has difficulty sleeping in the early part of the night, the middle part of the night, whether or not they enjoy their work and activities, whether or not they're agitated, are they fidgeting, playing with their hair, and so on. And you can see that each question has various kinds of answers that get a different score. So if a subject is playing with their hands and hair, et cetera, they get 2 points. But if they're hand-wringing, nail-biting, lip-chewing, and hair-pulling, they get 4 points. The problem with the HAM-D scale is that it's insensitive to real changes in one's depression. Here's one of the most problematic questions. The question is about the insight that a research subject has into their own illness. So if a research subject acknowledges that they're depressed and ill, they get 0 points. If they acknowledge that they're ill, but they attribute the cause of their illness to something exogenous, like stress at work or bad food, they get 1 point. And if they deny being ill, they get 2 points. So this question is twisted and perverse for a number of reasons. So one is just that if you're a rugged cowboy or a philosophical critic, you might be just guaranteed at the start of a trial to get 2 points. Right? But moreover, if you are a research subject in the drug group of a randomized trial, and you start the trial by denying being ill, and then you end the trial by acknowledging being ill because you in fact are ill, your HAM-D score would go down by 2 points, which is exactly the opposite of what you'd want in this measuring system. And we saw earlier that there are 3 questions on insomnia with 6 possible points and 4 possible points from fidgeting. So if you just had a drug which sort of slowed a person down, like a soporific, just a drug that made people kind of quieter and calmer, you could get their HAM-D score to go down by 10 points. And to put that in perspective, clinical guidelines have held that an antidepressant that lowers a HAM-D score by 3 points can be deemed clinically significant. Okay, for sake of time, well, no, I'll describe this one just very briefly. There's a tactic used in designing clinical trials which involves carefully selecting subjects into the trial population. Some of these tactics are fine or are justified on ethical grounds. So for example, we tend to exclude pregnant women from trials because we don't want to harm fetuses. Other tactics are a bit more nefarious. One tactic is called a run-in period. A run-in period works as follows. The trial recruits subjects, then the subjects are randomly allocated to a placebo group or a drug group. The subjects in the placebo group are tested to see how they do on placebo, and the subjects in the drug group are tested to see how they do on the drug before any hard data is collected. The subjects in the placebo group who are especially responsive to placebo, who get better on placebo, they're excluded from the remainder of the trial. The subjects in the drug group who do poorly on the drug, they're excluded from the remainder of the trial. And then hard data is gathered. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that that tactic systematically stacks the deck in favor of showing that experimental interventions are safer and more effective than they in fact are. Okay, I won't describe p-hacking or publication bias. These are pretty widespread and well-known biases in medical research. Okay, so to go back to our formalization of the master argument. Again, imagine you're sitting and you're reading the New York Times and you come across this story that says a trial was just published that shows that this drug does blah, blah, blah. And you go back and you ask yourself, well, I know that trials employ all of these different tactics to stack the deck in favor of interventions under investigation. So what are the chances that evidence like this would manifest whether or not the intervention in fact does blah, blah, blah? The chances are high. We know that medical research is designed to generate evidence that makes interventions appear safe and effective, even if those interventions are not safe and effective. Okay, back to the master argument. This term, the so-called likelihood, the probability that you'd get evidence that evidence that you in fact got, if the hypothesis were true, that term is low for strictly empirical reasons. A wide number of medical interventions under investigation in the last 30 or 40 years have tiny effect sizes. Some people speak of an effect size crisis. There's a crisis of effect sizes. What does this mean? It's hard to get interventions to appear more effective than placebo in randomized control trials. Why is that? We would not expect evidence like that if these interventions were in fact effective. So I'm just going to give you a bunch of examples. We've already seen the measuring scale used to measure effectiveness of antidepressants, the HAM-D scale, in the biggest and best meta-analyses that are testing antidepressants, the meta-analyses that get access to both published and unpublished data. Those meta-analyses show that antidepressants on average cause subjects' HAM-D score to go down by 1.8 points relative to placebo, 1.8 points. And we've seen that a drug that would just get you to fidget less could get your HAM-D score to go down by 4 points. Tamoxifen is a widely used drug for ER-positive, estrogen receptor-positive breast cancer. One of the most recent really large-scale randomized control trials, which gave tamoxifen to women with early-stage breast cancer for 10 years, showed that women getting tamoxifen had a 3% mortality reduction. That's tamoxifen for 10 years, not for 6 months or for 1 year, but for 10 years. And tamoxifen is an extremely serious intervention. Methylphenidate, a widely prescribed intervention for childhood attention deficit disorder. In the largest and longest trials that were funded by the National Institute of Mental Health and performed by scientists who had some degree of independence from industry, those trials that tested patient-level parameters at 3 years and 7 years follow-up showed that methylphenidate provides no patient-level benefits over placebo. This is a controversial example because there's been a lot of debate about the effectiveness of statins for prevention of heart disease. You have to give about 100 people statins over a period of 5 years to avoid 1 death by heart disease. There are many examples like this. Okay, so these examples, of course, well, I'll come back to this in just a second. So if we ask ourselves, would we see evidence like this if the interventions were in fact effective? The answer is no. When Banting and Best tested the effectiveness of insulin for modulating the symptoms of type 1 diabetes, they just started jabbing kids who were in a coma because the main mode of treatment of type 1 diabetes was starvation therapy. So children would fall into a coma, they would live until they were 15 or 16 years old, and then they would die. They just went into a ward full of children in comas and just started jabbing them with exogenous insulin, and the children just kind of woke up out of their comas. The symptom relief was miraculous. Insulin is obviously an effective intervention for type 1 diabetes. And we don't see effects like that in a wide range of interventions under investigation in recent generations. So the probability of seeing evidence that we in fact see, those tiny effect sizes, is really low if those interventions are in fact effective. Okay. The prior probability of the hypothesis is the hypothesis that is the probability that the hypothesis is true before you get any new evidence. That term is low for a reason that I'm calling a dearth of magic bullets. This term, magic bullets, comes from the chemist Paul Ehrlich, who was searching for magic bullets. He was searching for interventions that had a high degree of potency and a high degree of specificity. This is Ehrlich and his colleague Sahachiro Hata. They were looking for a drug for syphilis. The treatment for syphilis at the time was mercury, which was, of course, highly nonspecific. Mercury was used for something like 2,000 diseases, and it was toxic and not very effective. And they found a magic bullet. They found what is now taken to be one of the first or the first antimicrobial agents, and it was effective at curing syphilis. Sometimes in popular writing about medicine, we read about magic bullets or silver bullets in medicine. So here, for example, is a cover story about Gleevec, which is one of the most impressive medical interventions in recent generations. It has been called a magic bullet. Sometimes this kind of rhetoric gets exaggerated. So here, for example, is a psychiatrist talking about Prozac. Prozac is a revolution in psychopharmacology because of its selectivity on the serotonin system. It's a drug with the precision of a Scud missile, launched miles away from its target only to land with a proud flare right on the enemy's roof. So here we have the magic bullet metaphor really exaggerated, right? And unfortunately, most of medicine today operates without magic. There are very, very few magic bullets in medicine in the last 60 or 70 years. That's for a few reasons. One reason has to do with the complexity of the pathophysiological basis of many diseases that we're trying to intervene on. So to continue the example of depression, here's a causal model of depression offered to us by some of our leading research psychiatrists. This is kind of small, so I'll zoom in again. The nodes in this causal graph are themselves really complicated social phenomena, like has a subject ever had lifetime trauma? Have they ever been divorced? Do they have low self-esteem? And these nodes are connected together in this just massively complicated causal nexus. Complex biological systems have a property that is called robustness. If you intervene on one node, the system can get around that intervention. It's hard to intervene on a complex system to change its properties in important ways. So the pathophysiological basis of diseases is extremely complicated. The second theoretical reason why we have few magic bullets today is the way exogenous interventions modulate our physiology. The way drugs work is as ligands. So a drug binds to a receptor and turns that receptor on and off. It turns out that there's a one-to-many relationship between ligand, drug, and receptor, which the drug turns on or off. So a single drug can modulate a bunch of different receptors. It turns out that there's a one-to-many relationship between receptor activation and biochemical pathway, which is turned up or down. So a single receptor, which is turned up or down, can modulate multiple biochemical pathways. It turns out that there's a one-to-many relationship between activated biochemical pathway and physiological effects, depending on which tissue the biochemical pathway is in. So we have this massively complex cascading series of effects from a one-to-many relationship between ligand to receptor, between receptor to biochemical pathway, and biochemical pathway to physiological effect. So one kind of way I like to try to visualize this is imagine there are some fish swimming at the bottom of this cascade, and we want to get that fish a glass of wine. And you go to the top of the cascade way up here, and you pour a glass of wine into the cascade. How much wine are you to get to that fish? Okay, so there's two physical reasons why we have few magic bullets today. The complexity of the pathophysiological basis of diseases, and the complexity of the way in which exogenous interventions modulate our pathophysiology. Those two reasons entail that we have few magic bullets. Most of our magic bullets, like penicillin, target very specific and very simple pathophysiological states. Or diseases of deficiency, like scurvy, or type 1 diabetes, Like, your body doesn't have enough vitamin C, your body doesn't have enough insulin, just puts them in. Diseases of deficiency and diseases of infection are especially good targets for magic bullets. So many of the examples of very effective medical interventions in recent years, like treatments for HIV, treatments for hepatitis C, these are treatments for infectious diseases. Some childhood cancers are, there are some targets for magic bullets in recent years, but not many. Most interventions today are not magic bullets. Okay, so this is the master argument. I gave like a few little details to illustrate a few of the key arguments in the master argument. When you sum it all up, you are left with a view which is pessimistic about many medical interventions today. The best physicians have a sense that this is all right. The best physicians already know a lot of this. So here is the results of a survey of the readers of the British Medical Journal. The British Medical Journal ran a survey asking its readers, most of whom are either physicians or medical students, asking what are the most important medical discoveries in the last 150 years. And here's what they said. Access to clean drinking water was the most important. That's number one, access to clean drinking water. Penicillin, or antibiotics. Anesthesia. Vaccines. The structure of DNA. The germ theory of disease. The birth control pill. Evidence-based medicine, like the program of evidence-based medicine. Radiological techniques. And my personal favorite, the computer. These are the 10 most important medical breakthroughs according to readers of the British Medical Journal in the last 150 years. So, and I think that this is basically right. I mean, if you ask yourself what discoveries have had the most important impact on health broadly construed, sure, access to clean drinking water, antibiotics, vaccines, anesthesia, the computer, yes, I think this is basically right. But notice that there are no psychiatric medications on the list, no medications for heart disease, there are no statins, there are no blood pressure lowering drugs. Okay, so for sake of time, so there are a number of obvious objections that one can sort of relatively easily think about to this thesis. And we can talk about these during Q&A, but for sake of time, you'll just have to take my word for it that none of these objections are persuasive at all. I want to end by talking about this notion of gentle medicine. So in the book, I go through these various arguments, and the conclusion of the arguments is, okay, we ought to be skeptical about a lot of medicine. Okay, and then the question is, okay, well, so what? What does that mean for our attitude towards medicine now going forward? And I coined this term, gentle medicine. To the extent that you find the thesis of medical nihilism compelling, it suggests changes to various aspects of medicine. One obvious one is clinical practice, but it also suggests changes to the research agenda, to methodological standards, to regulatory standards, and maybe even to intellectual property laws. So start with clinical practice. A lot of medicine today is highly interventionist. Right? Physicians are trained to act, and patients want action. Patients want intervention. One of my colleagues, physician Mark Tonelli, argues that medicine needs to have much less interventionism. We need like therapeutic conservatism. And that, I think, is right. So a lot of medical practice involves situations in which physicians are faced with a lot of uncertainty, interventions that they're not really sure will help much or not. And the idea with non-interventionism is in those situations to basically wait and see. Non-interventionism is not the sort of audacious view that you never do anything in medicine. I mean, I've already noted that we have these really wonderful magic bullets. So if you have an ear infection, you should take penicillin. And if you're in a cycling accident bleeding out on the side of the road, you should go to an intensive care unit. But those states are ones in which we have good reason to think that our interventions are going to be helpful. Okay. Medicine, the way the research agenda gets set in medicine is not geared towards, or is not optimized towards studying interventions that are exactly what we need. So I went through two physical reasons why we have few magic bullets, but there's a third kind of sociological reason. The vast majority of medical research is funded by private industry, and industry has the main motive of profit. So if a company sees another company making a lot of profit from a particular kind of intervention, that second company might be incentivized to pursue an intervention just like that. These are called Me Too drugs. So company one has a new antidepressant making billions of dollars per year. Company two says, I also want an antidepressant just like that. I want Me Too. I want a drug like that. So there are many different Me Too drugs in medicine introduced in the recent decades. That means that a huge amount of resources are devoted to pursuing interventions that have little incremental benefit to patients. If we step back and ask, what are the optimal ways in which we could set the research agenda? That wouldn't be it. There are other ways. We ought to be rethinking the medical and clinical research agenda so that we're pursuing interventions that are, in fact, effective, in fact, helpful. This connects with the first point about modulating clinical practice. So one obvious way in which clinical practice could be modulated, as I've already noted, is to be less interventionist. But we actually have very little hard empirical evidence about what that could look like. We have mountains of empirical evidence testing the effects of this intervention or that intervention with highly sophisticated methods like randomized trials. So if you want to know what are the effects of giving patients a drug like this, you can run a randomized trial. We have a huge amount of evidence like that. But we have very little evidence on what it's like to be non-interventionist, or very little evidence on what it's like to take patients off drugs. There are a few programs that are called drug withdrawal programs or drug discontinuation programs, where patients who are on, say, too many pharmaceuticals are gradually taken off their pharmaceuticals. But it's one thing to learn about the effects of putting patients on pharmaceuticals. It's another thing to take them off. And so one way in which the research agenda could be modified is to study those kinds of questions. Okay. The third kind of pillar of gentle medicine is to modulate methodological standards. So I've argued that one of the key problems with medical research is the design and analysis and publication and interpretation of randomized trials. Now, some critics of medical research complain about randomized trials and say we should get rid of them. I'm not one of them. I think the randomized trial is extremely important, but needs to be designed and analyzed and interpreted more carefully than it currently is, than they currently are. The fourth pillar of gentle medicine is modulations of regulatory standards. So the key regulatory standard in question is the one that's required for drug approval. The FDA requires 2 positive randomized control trials for a new drug to be approved. There are sometimes exceptions to this, but that's the standard. That's the norm. So if you want to get a new drug approved, you've got to perform 2 randomized trials in which the drug performs better than placebo or better than a competitor drug. Now, I've already pointed out a bunch of potential problems with randomized trials, and that 2 positive trial standard is grossly insufficient for a number of reasons. Here's just like the most obvious reason. It doesn't take into account publication bias. So you can perform 20 randomized trials, get positive results in 2 of them, publish those 2, and then get drug approval. That's just one kind of gross and obvious example in which the 2 positive trial standard is insufficient, but there are a number of other problems. Okay, the final pillar of gentle medicine is to modulate the intellectual property landscape of medicine. The norm is that industrial sponsors of new drugs get 20 years of patent protection on a new intervention. That includes the time it takes to test the intervention in the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials. So normally, sponsors get about 10 or 12 years of patent protection on new drugs. Some people say that's not enough. Some people say we should be giving more intellectual property protection to incentivize new research and development. Other people say that's too much. We should be giving less patent protection because the intellectual property regime, as it currently stands, incentivizes things like Me Too drugs and biased research. Now, for sake of time, I'm not going to dive into the various arguments for and against this. I'll just flag it as one domain of this notion of gentle medicine that I think is worth thinking about in the future. Okay, so in short, to the extent that you find this thesis of medical nihilism persuasive, I hope you'll agree that it suggests some changes to some aspects of medicine, including the way in which, the extent to which we're interventionist in the patient-physician encounter, the different kinds of research questions we think are worth pursuing, and the standards with which we hold the research about those questions. And that is it. Thank you.
Okay, so we have some time for questions. And Magda, can you help me with the microphone? So please raise your hand if you have a question. Magda will bring you the microphone so we can get you on a recording and so everyone can hear you. So please just raise your hand. Got one back there.
Thank you. I liked your presentation very much. I'm kind of a silver bullet type of guy, and I was just wondering what your thoughts were on some specificity with some of the research, like immunotherapeutic research. And then also, you had the DNA helix up there for, the 10 most effective inventions since 1840. Along those lines, with regard to diseases that are genetic in nature, what about some of the CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing for somatic cells, not necessarily germ cells? So those 2 things I'd like to get your thoughts on. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. So let me try to first completely generalize the question and then dive into the specific versions of it. So the completely general version of the question is, are there promising ways in which medicine can develop more specific and more effective interventions using any number of new forms of technologies, including immunological kinds of interventions or genetic interventions. And so that's the kind of generalized version of the question. And the kind of answer to the generalized version of the question is, I'm kind of a glass half empty, glass half full sort of person. So I don't want to speculate too much on how promising these particular technologies are, although I think we have some reasons to think that some of them are going to be as miraculous as insulin for type 1 diabetes. So the CRISPR-Cas9 example, I think, is persuasive in this regard. We know, we have really, really solid knowledge that some diseases have a really simple genetic basis, right? And now we have technologies to modulate that. So that seems to me promising. The kind of theoretical framework of magic bullets, the thinking about the complexity of the pathophysiological basis of many diseases, I think suggests that those technologies are going to be useful for a limited range of diseases, but anyways, useful for those diseases. Yeah. Thanks.
Actually, the job that I do is basically getting medical devices approved through regulatory bodies. And so I was wondering that the sort of nihilism that you see in pharmaceutical industry, does that extend to medical devices as well? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, thanks for this question. So let me also generalize this question too. So some people ask me, do these arguments apply to surgical interventions? Do they apply to devices? Do they apply to imaging technologies and so on? And I think that the devil is always in the details. So with some devices, I think that the arguments aren't as persuasive. So the kind of skeptical arguments aren't as persuasive. So let me give a quick feeling for why that's the case. One is we design, for many medical devices, we design them with the pathophysiological target completely known and in mind, informing the design of the intervention. So for example, think about the difference between a pharmaceutical intervention for a psychiatric disease, and we have no idea about the pathophysiological basis of the disease, and we have no real idea about how the intervention modulates that unknown pathophysiology, versus designing a parachute to slow our fall out of an airplane, right? We design that parachute with really, really well-known physical principles. We don't need to test a parachute in a randomized control trial, right? Where some patients get the parachute and some patients get placebo, right? And I think that that's true with many medical devices. So that's on the kind of magic bullet pillar of the argument. The biased methodological standards, the trials being corrupted by financial incentives, also I think is a little bit less persuasive when it comes to medical devices. So many pharmaceuticals, they're expensive only because they're protected by intellectual property, right? Once the research and development is done, the actual production of the product is really cheap. It's like selling MP3s for music. The expensive bit is in the production of the music, but once you want to distribute the product, it's incredibly cheap. And that can create a financial incentive to get the product to appear safer and effective than it really is, and then just distribute it as much as you can. Whereas with devices, many devices are extremely expensive to develop, and the market is smaller, and you need some expert to be involved in the implementation or insertion of the device and the management of the device. And so it's a much more labor-intensive form of intervention. Now, I don't want to say that none of these problems apply to medical devices ever. I just think that they apply to a lesser degree. but anyways, I'd be happy to hear what you think about that maybe after the Q&A. I'd like to hear if you're a kind of medical device nihilist or not.
Yeah, I was just kind of curious about what relationship you felt that medical nihilism has to health economics, and whether like any of the proposals that are kind of out there right now would affect your viewpoint or, kind of like change your stance at all.
So can you say a bit more? I mean, health economics is this huge and broad domain with like many questions and issues. So can you say a bit more specifically what you mean?
Yeah, I'm talking more so about like some of the proposals that address interventionalism to make it more kind of like authentic or thoughtful, or even like universal healthcare, or like a more socialized version of healthcare where it's not so much about prescriptions.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So, yeah, I don't have well worked out views on this. Some people, when they've commented on this kind of work, they will say things like, oh, well, if Stegenga is right and we follow what he has to say, we'll have cheaper healthcare. And maybe that's true. I mean, maybe that's true if we have, like, say, fewer physician visits and fewer, but it's not, but I don't see that it's obviously true. I mean, if we went with this kind of gentle medicine approach, I mean, part of gentle medicine is to think, well, what are the other ways in which we can intervene on people other than pharmaceuticals? And that might include research on, say, lifestyle changes or different forms of therapy. So, and those different kinds of interventions might in fact be more expensive than just prescribing pharmaceuticals. So I don't have a kind of very strong view about whether or not a healthcare system which is like more nihilist would be cheaper or more expensive. I think it would be better for our health, but it might be more costly too. I'm open to that, yeah.
Enjoyed your talk very much. There were a couple of guys who lived about 100 years ago, Bernard Shaw being one of them, and William Osler being another. Shaw made scathing indictments of physicians and pointed out things like, why would you pay a surgeon to cut off your leg and so forth. And in Osler's situation, he was accused by many of being a therapeutic nihilist, but he seemed to be more careful about using drugs unless there was evidence that they worked.
Yep.
And so I wondered if you have comments about those two things. And then one other thing, and that is I think one of the biggest problems we have is conflict of interest.
Yes, good. Thank you for these comments. And I wholeheartedly endorse these. So I think medicine needs more Osler. That's a central commitment of this view. So I mentioned this notion of like therapeutic inertia. And I think that was a kind of core idea of Osler. So we should just be, like, if we're faced with a patient and we're not really sure what to do, we're not really sure what intervention is going to help this patient, inertia is better than intervention. That was a core idea, and I think that that's right. And then you mentioned the role of conflicts of interest, and yes, this is like a core problem of medicine today. The conflicts of interest are just shot through everywhere in every aspect of medicine. One aspect that's particularly interesting to me is in the testing of interventions. So we have this situation in which the industrial manufacturers of interventions are responsible for the testing of the safety and the effectiveness of those interventions. And that seems completely wrong-headed to me. So with a number of colleagues around the world, we're developing kind of platform for arguing that that form of conflict of interest should be minimized in medicine. That's just one of many. Committees who are responsible for articulating new disease categories, committees that are responsible for developing patient guidelines. These committees are populated by members who have gross conflicts of interest with respect to financial incentives for the kinds of products that are under question. Medicine is shot through with these problems. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. So when you introduced the master argument, you used the word confidence synonymously with probability, but those are very different things. So I thought maybe you could just speak a little bit to those.
Yeah, thanks for this question. So this is Magda, there was a question in the center there too. So this is a really important question. Philosophers like to use, so there are different interpretations of probability. Some people think that probability is just like the roll of a dice, so there are 6 sides on a dice, and so the probability of getting a 6 is just 1 in 6. Probability is an objective feature of the world. Other people like to use probability to model our subjective confidence in things. Like, what's the probability that, I don't know, who's playing in the Baseball World Series right now?
Astros in Washington.
Okay, so what's the probability that the Nationals are going to win the World Series? Of course, you can inform that probability with a bunch of statistics, with a bunch of facts about the world. I mean, you know certain things about this team and that team and where they're playing and so on. But still, you have to make a prediction about the future, about a single case, about a single event, like will this team win or not. And so some philosophers like to say, in cases like that, it makes sense to think about our confidence in terms of probability. But I'm glad you're raising this question because I didn't dwell on this at all in the presentation, but that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm using probability as a measure of subjective confidence. And so whose confidence? Yours, mine, ours? I was being a little bit kind of quick and fast with this. So my view is it's the royal we. It's physicians, patients, and policymakers. That's the confidence that I'm interested in. So I think the confidence of physicians, patients, and policymakers should be lower when thinking about the effectiveness of medical interventions. Yeah.
You just mentioned the issue of patients. I would question your comment with regard to medical devices because I think there's an issue that hasn't been discussed, which has to do with transparency, which has to do with whether it's a hip replacement, a shoulder, or a defibrillator where the wires break and we have servers that are not available to either the public or other physicians. From a regulatory standpoint, it's a whole big issue, and I'm not sure it's any less important than the medication. But the other question I have is, you haven't really addressed, at least tonight, I'm sure you're considered it, is where does the consumer, where is the patient in all of this? And how does the physician's practice change, and where's the transparency? So it's a little convoluted, and it's lots of pieces, and it may be, but I would be interested in your comments on those issues.
Yeah, thanks very much. So it's an important set of issues, and it's not one, it's certainly not one. Let me just focus on the patient's perspective and the patient's role as consumer in the medical encounter. It's not one that I spoke about tonight. And of course, it's extremely important because the patient as consumer has pre-existing beliefs and expectations and hopes and demands, and that can contribute to many different features of medicine that are problematic. One is overdiagnosis and overprescription. And I'm often asked from individuals taking the perspective of a patient, my opinion about this or that condition or this or that intervention. And I always try to avoid those questions because really I take these arguments not to be directed towards patients. And that's because, in my view, the particular kind of question that I'm interested in, namely assessing the effectiveness of medical interventions, is one which requires a great deal of training and expertise, and it's not even expertise that physicians themselves have. So, for instance, just to give you a kind of example of that, the complicated statistics which are employed in testing whether or not this drug is more effective than placebo comes along with a set of issues which are like deep and hard and really sort of difficult to understand. The role of the patient's perspective in questions like that is quite thorny. So here's another way to put it, and I get into trouble with this very often. So when a patient is consuming an intervention, they have first-person perspective on their experience. So they kind of know what's happening to them in some sense. But the ascription of what's happening to them as an effect of the intervention that they've consumed is an inference that I'm not always comfortable to go along with. So there are three kind of key problems with this inference. One is that many diseases have a natural course of progression such that symptoms get gradually better over time, or symptoms fluctuate and gradually get better over time. So just the mere passage of time, symptoms get better. The second issue is the placebo effect, which we're all familiar with. And the third issue is confirmation bias, which is the tendency of all of us, including patients and physicians, to notice evidence which confirms their beliefs and ignore evidence which disconfirms their beliefs. So all of that means those three issues, like the natural course of disease, the placebo effect, and confirmation bias, entail that first-person experience is typically an unreliable guide to making causal inferences. So when it comes to the kind of research questions that I have in mind here, namely, does this drug do blah, 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 I'm not very willing to go along with first-person cases. That includes both patient experience and physician expertise. Now, the difficult aspect of that is, for many effects of interventions, that's all we have to go on. And medicine, the cutting edge of thinking about research in medicine, must face this problem. So we need some way to systematically incorporate patient's experience and physician expertise with the results of randomized controlled trials and meta-analyses. So most of evidence-based medicine says, if we want to know, does this drug do blah, 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 we have to pay attention to randomized trials and meta-analyses. It completely leaves out the voice of the patient and the expertise of the physician. And while, when I was going through this issue about the natural course of disease, the placebo effect, and confirmation bias, I'm sort of showing my cards, and I'm showing that I'm pretty sympathetic to that evidence-based medicine view. Nevertheless, there's this massive source of evidence, namely patient experience and physician expertise, that current evidence-based medicine is neglecting. And we need some way to systematically incorporate them.
I'd like to know your thoughts on medical education. As a patient, I do have this innate fear of the government and big pharma and all this stuff. But also as a future medical student, I have this fear of, what do I trust? Do I trust everything that they're feeding me in medical school? Because now I have, a whole slew of patients that I need to take care of. So both as a medical student and as a patient, how do we educate ourselves better?
Yeah, good question. So there are organizations of, this comes back to one of the earlier questions about conflicts of interest. So many people are worried about conflicts of interest in medical education. So you're asking, well, who do we trust? One worry is that medical education is being unduly influenced by conflicts of interest. That includes like organized medical education events where the event is paid for and the agenda is set by groups or companies who have financial conflicts of interest. It can also include, say, the authors of textbooks. So you're trained, your medical education is largely determined by the content of textbooks, and textbook authors typically have massive conflicts of interest. And so conflicts of interest permeate medical education, so the question is, who do you trust? There are groups of medical students who are pushing back against this. So there are organizations of medical students who, which have as a mandate to resist this kind of conflict of interest. And speaking a little bit more optimistically, I mean, when I'm working with physicians who are hospital-based and university-based physicians, so physicians who are involved in some clinical work but also involved in medical education, they tend to be the ones for whom the kind of message that I'm pitching here is pretty familiar. These are people who regularly read the BMJ and know like a lot of the concerns that I'm articulating, and those are the ones, those are the physicians, those are the medical educators who I would trust. So my first teaching job was in University of Utah, and part of my teaching requirement was to teach in medical schools, and I spent some time shadowing a psychiatrist who he was working in like an intensive psychiatric unit, so most of his patients were like really, really troubled patients. But he conceived of his job as trying to get patients off as many drugs as possible. So a typical patient for him would be on like multiple pharmaceuticals and 2 or 3 recreational drugs, and he would have access to them for only 2 or 3 days because of various financial and institutional constraints. And during those 2 or 3 days, he would try to figure out a kind of drug withdrawal plan that was going to do the least harm to this patient. And that's a doctor that I would trust. Yeah.
So if we took the gentle medicine paradigm, what would it tell us about responding to major public health emergencies like the flu pandemic or AIDS or Ebola?
Yeah.
Do we have lessons to learn about that, or do we have cautionary things to consider as we apply it in those kinds of situations?
Okay, this is a super question. Thank you. So, so just to reiterate, gentle medicine is not the kind of audacious view that we don't sort of do anything in light of challenging, medical issues, including pandemics. And if anything, pandemics are a good example of the kinds of things that we have some tools for. Right? So infectious diseases are good targets for magic bullets, and some of the interventions that are, I think, rightly recognized as among the most important medical interventions, like going back to the BMJ top 10 list, are public health interventions that are geared towards modulating public health problems like pandemics, so clean drinking water, for example. There's this famous thesis in the history of medicine called the McEwen thesis, which argues that the increase in lifespan of people in Western society post-industrial revolution had little to do with medical interventions and had much more to do with broader sociological, socioeconomic kinds of things, like an increase in the middle class, which led to an increase in quality nutrition, which led to a decrease in infant mortality. It wasn't streptomycin targeting tuberculosis. It was more people having more to eat or access to clean drinking water. And so that kind of thinking, I think, is persuasive and important. And so when it comes to pandemics or like large-scale public health concerns, gentle medicine, I think, has the intellectual resources to make sense of them and understand why some of our interventions for medical problems like that are effective. Yeah.
So if I'm going into the doctor tomorrow morning and I don't have any specific complaints, but it's an annual checkup or whatever, but my doctor has signaled in previous appointments that he's worried about this thing on my blood test or that thing on my blood test, and I'm going to go see him tomorrow. Does general medicine as an approach give any advice to me in my sort of encounter with the doctor?
Okay, thanks, Matt, for this question. So this is, okay, some critics of medicine are even skeptical about this very quotidian practice of regular checkups and should you get this test done and that test done, because we're looking for, in a kind of preliminary fashion, screening for different kinds of ailments that you might have. And that quotidian practice itself has come under fire in recent years. So take screening, for example. We have this kind of platitudinous view that screening for some diseases is obviously a good thing, because if you can find a case of pathophysiology earlier rather than later, you can intervene on it more effectively. So we have screening programs for all sorts of things, breast cancer, prostate cancer. Recently, critics have argued that the problem is with these kinds of routine tests, they have a large number of false positives, which leads to widespread overdiagnosis and overtreatment. When randomized trials are done on screening programs, it turns out that there's no screening program which reduces all-cause mortality due to any cause. There are 4 screening programs that cause a decrease in disease-specific mortality. So if you screen for disease X, you can lower mortality as caused by disease X, but you don't lower all-cause mortality. So skeptics have said, what's going on there? Why is that? We're lowering mortality caused by this particular disease, but we're not lowering all-cause mortality. Cynics say, that's because we're increasing mortality in other ways. So they'll say things like, breast cancer screening programs has a large dose of radiation. Even just getting the car and driving to the screening program comes with risks that can be lethal. And so I don't have a settled view on this. This is something that I don't want to make a kind of strong case for one way or the other. Yeah.
Okay, so that's all the time we have. We're going to be selling copies of the speaker's book out front, and Dr. Stegenga will be there to sign books and chat with you for a moment. Please join me in thanking him for his lecture tonight.